Welcome everyone. This is a special edition of the Benjamin Dixon Show. It'll be hosted by Nick and Kelly. We're going to be introducing and interviewing John Perkins, the author of The New Confessions of an Economic Hitman. So I'm very, very glad to have John on the show. How you doing, John?
I'm doing great, Nick. Thanks very much. It's great to be with you guys.
Yeah, you know, John, I was telling you before, outside of the actual cast itself, that you know, basically, I had seen you multiple times on Democracy Now! And I think the first time I heard it, you know, sometimes the first time you're exposed to something, you don't really absorb it. But then the second time, I had already read another book by Stephen Mincer called Overthrow, and it put everything in your book into a whole new perspective. So, you know, your book is The New Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Back then, this book wasn't out. It was just Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Now you've added another section that's talking about stuff that's more current and a lot of stuff that's actually domestic. But both books are absolutely great books, and I would like to take this time, you know, just outside of the books, to go ahead and have you introduce yourself to our audience. I know I've talked about those two books, but let's go ahead and do that first.
Well, thanks, Nick. I guess that's a pretty good introduction. I was an economic hitman. This is back in the 70s. My official title was chief economist at a major Boston-based consulting firm, and my job was to identify countries that had resources our corporations want, like oil, for example, and then arrange a huge loan to those countries from one of the big banks, like the World Bank or one of its sister organizations, and that money would actually go to pay our own corporations, Bechtel, Halliburton, Brown and Root, Stone and Webster, familiar names, many of us, to build big infrastructure projects in those countries and make huge profits in the process, I might add. The projects they built, power plants, industrial parks, things like that, would help a few wealthy families in the country, the families that own the industries, the commercial centers, but most everybody else would suffer as a result because money would be diverted from education, healthcare, and other social services to try to pay off the interest on the debt. And in the end, the principal would never be paid off. And so at some point we go back and say, since you can't pay your debts, sell your resource, oil, whatever, real cheap to our corporations without any environmental or social regulations. Privatize. Sell off your utilities, your electric systems, your water and sewage systems, your schools, your prisons, your banks, everything like that to our own corporations. And in the few cases where we failed, where leaders of countries didn't accept these deals, people we called jackals, CIA assets, would go in and either overthrow or assassinate those presidents. And unfortunately, Nick, two of my clients, Jaime Roldos, president of Ecuador, and Omar Torrijos of Panama, didn't play the game. I couldn't convince them to play the game, and they were both assassinated. And I just mentioned that the reason I wrote this New Confessions 12 years after the last one was published is because really that system that we developed and used in the developing countries has come home to roost now in the United States, Europe, and the rest of the world. And it's really, we've all been hit, and we know that the system today is a global failure. We know that the economic system we've built is causing the oceans to rise and glaciers to melt, and tremendous inequality of resources and income around the planet. So we have to change it, and that's really why I wrote the book, to help strategize a change.
So let's talk about, you know, the term. You're going to use the term EHM. You're going to use the term the jackal, and I guess the third wing will be the actual military itself. So you, as an economic hitman, you would go and be introduced to these leaders, and what was your primary goal in convincing them to actually take on the burdens of the loans?
Well, really, when you come right down to it, we were building an empire And we did. It was successful. It's probably the first truly global empire in history. And it's been built primarily without the military, although in recent years the military stepped back in a big way. But we built it primarily through debt. And it's not a national empire for the first time in history. It's not an American empire, really. It's a corporate empire. The American government pretty much stands behind it, the Pentagon, the CIA, people like me in my old job stand behind it, but it's really a corporate empire. It's run by big corporations. And that is both a problem, and it gives us the answer to how do we solve this, because corporations are fairly malleable. We the people ultimately have a lot of control over corporations if we will just choose to exercise that control.
That is a very, very interesting thought, that us as individuals have the ability to actually try to shape the what actually goes on with the corporations. Is it what kind of mechanism do you feel that the populace has to actually exert control over this?
Well, I think it's important for us to recognize that corporations totally depend on us to buy their goods and services, to work for them, to run them, to invest in them, to support them through our tax dollars. There's really two realities in the world, really. The two main types of reality. There's what we might call objective reality. These computers and TV screens and the earphones that you're wearing and the microphones we're talking to, those are objective reality. But bigger than that is the perceived reality. And we human beings are hugely influenced by perceived reality. And basically, all of our institutions are perceived realities. Cultures are perceived realities. Corporations are perceived realities. Countries are perceived realities. So corporations are just these perceived realities that then are codified into laws and follow a set of principles. But because they're perceived realities that then impact the objective reality, we can change the perceptions. And I can get into this in more detail, but the perception of what a good corporation was when I was in business school in the late 60s changed radically in the 1970s. And that changed everything. It created a failed global economy. What happened in the 1970s? Now we need to change that perception, that perceived reality. We need to transform it into a new perceived reality.
I actually really do understand that. Now, to go back, not that we're going to actually come back to this because this is going to tie in, but when you read the books, what is it that you want the actual reader to actually take from this? Is it more you want them to understand, and knowing is half the battle, that this is what it is? Is it more like a chance to shock or inform the populace about what actually goes on, or is there a greater lesson that you would like for us to actually get from it? Because when people read a book like this, the first thing they're going to want to do out of hand is reject it, because the reality is so ugly. And I think Ben has talked about this before, but just going back to the book, what would you like for the book to actually accomplish in terms of to the listeners or the readers?
Well, thanks for asking that question, Nick. It's I think the first book, mainly I wanted to get it off my chest. I wanted to get it out there. I had been to Ground Zero right after 9/11. I was in the Amazon on 9/11, went to Ground Zero. And I was so taken by what happened there, and by the fact that our government was reacting in such a weird way by saying we ought to go shopping, we ought to go attack Iraq, and even then most everybody figured out that Iraq probably wasn't the problem. And so I stood there at Ground Zero. It was still smoldering, and I decided I just had to get the story out, primarily to explain the way this system works, because I think I'm a very loyal American. My family goes back to before the American Revolution, fought in the American Revolution, and every major war since. And I think it's a terrible shame that we've taken this course that's created so much animosity in the world, and we've taken a leadership role in creating this economy that I call a failed economy. I really call it a death economy. So it's time for us to understand that, and then turn it around and create something I call a life economy. But the first book was really written to expose that system so that people would understand it. The New Confessions of an Economic Hitman, which just came out within the last couple of months, it's 12 years later, really updates it and incidentally people often ask me, do I have to read the first one before I read the second one? And the answer is absolutely no. Just buy the second one. It's got all the main stuff in it, but it's got this whole new section, including 15 chapters of a strategy for change, lists of things that we can do, strategies of things every one of your listeners can do, whether your listener is a teacher or a social worker, an artist, a plumber, a carpenter, a parent, whatever. It's something we all can do to turn this around. You know, we need to create an economic system that supports a life economy, that supports an economy that's truly a renewable resource. We're on the road to doing that. We've already begun it. We're headed down that road, but we have to move down that road a lot faster.
Okay, and I think that is very, very important. That's kind of what I felt when I read the book. I know you talk about your own internal conflict and your own experience kind of moving through the book, but I felt like between the first one and the second one, I read both of them, and the second one has the first one in it, so more or less, and then it adds a new section. But I kind of felt that was really what was in there, that you wanted us to kind of understand what is going on, and then be able to look at strategies that have worked from other people, as well as strategies that you've seen to kind of start pushing us in the right direction, or at least to give us some tools by which we can begin to resist. Because so far, we really haven't started that resistance, so to speak. If you could talk about the brickmakers and the RICO scenario, I think that sticks out as one of the times you had people, kind of standing up. If you could go ahead and elaborate on that, or just kind of give a brief synopsis and what was important about it.
Wow, well, it's a very old story. It's when I was in the Peace Corps in Ecuador, and I spent the first couple of years in the Peace Corps in the Amazon rainforest with indigenous people there. And then I was moved up into the Andes for the last year or the third year to work with the brickmakers co-op to help them organize themselves into a marketing co-op so that they didn't get screwed by middlemen who bought the bricks very cheap from them and sold them much more expensively to construction companies. And they were, as they formed a co-op, and they were resisting some of this, and one of them had gone to the mayor of the city and complained, and shortly after that was killed, hit by a truck. It was pretty obvious to most people it wasn't an accident, and the community was scared, and they were willing to do just about anything not to let that happen again. And they really were giving in, and I persuaded them that it wasn't the authorities that were going to be able to help them, that they had to stand up for their own rights. It was really important that they take matters into their hands and understand that they had a right to change, and I get deeply involved in that. And it worked for them. And it usually works for people. And so it's an example of where we are today. I think this time of this presidential election is very important because we have to recognize that no matter who the next president is, he or she will not have a lot of power. It's very limited. And this is a democracy. And in a democracy, we the people are supposed to have the power. The problem has been that with the election laws the way they are, where big money is so important, and where even a candidate, let's say Bernie Sanders wins, it doesn't take any money from any big corporations, he's still going to be surrounded by members of Congress, the Senate, lobbyists that have tremendous connections to big corporations, and they will call the shots. And we need to understand that and not expect our presidents to work miracles, but to understand that we're the ones that have to do it. So whoever your candidate is, I'd encourage you to think about what is it that appeals to you about your candidate. What are the big issues that most appeal to you? And if your candidate gets elected, just push hard for those issues. Don't expect the candidate to do it alone. You go out and use social media. Social media is so powerful. Use everything you've got to push that issue. If your candidate doesn't get elected, don't just give in. Push the issue anyway. Use social media. Start a consumer movement. Start political movements. There's so much we as individuals can do. And in a way, we've really allowed big money and powerful interests to usurp our democracy. They've been very clever. They've used the media in very clever ways, but we've allowed it also. There's been a lot of lethargy. And just saying, well, geez, if just so-and-so gets elected, if just Obama gets elected, if just so-and-so gets elected, everything will be fine. Well, It doesn't work that way, and we need to understand that.
Let me take it back. There was two things I want to pull out about that brick story. So number one, we have people who are inside of the transaction or inside of the economy, so to speak, and their only purpose is to act as a middleman, and their only purpose is to extract money from the transaction, but not actually add any value to the product. They didn't actually add anything to the brick. All they did was transport the brick, or maybe not even transport the brick, just serve as like a connection maker between the people who actually made the bricks and the people who are buying them. And I think it's important that we understand that, that is a model that exists throughout our economy. And you said it was a failed economy, and part of the reason is there's a lot of people there that are middlemen and they're just usurping. But what I liked about what you said was how they ruled through fear, and only through solidarity and working together could they actually overcome and create what they made was a co-op that's fairly successful and it worked out for them. So I really like that story, particularly for that reason. That's why I clung to it and I listened to it over and over and over, because I think that that's a massive lesson. Like, that's something that we all need to be aware of. Now, moving on to the elected officials, I think I have an internal struggle with this. I think I've spoken with Ben about this too. But I know you say elected officials can't do it all alone, and you're right, they can't. But there are some elected officials that are strong enough of character and strength of will that they can actually resist being in a tide of garbage. There are people that are be a rock pointing in the right direction, and a tide is flowing in the completely opposite way. They will be eroded eventually over time, but they are there, and we have to make sure we reach out and support those people. In your book, you spoke about the vast difference on foreign policy between Carter and Reagan. Could you kind of expand on that a little bit?
Well, yeah, it's not quite sure where you want to go with that, but there was obviously a huge difference in that Reagan was a very conservative Republican who went after communism and tried to basically pin communism on everybody he didn't like Torrijos of Panama and Roldós of Ecuador, who both were assassinated very shortly after Reagan came into power. Reagan had this very, very dark, conservative view of the world, and anybody he didn't like, he'd label as a communist, and we'd go after him. But Carter was a very, very different person, personality-wise, and the Democratic platform was quite different at the time. But another major difference was that Reagan actually had a lot of political clout. He had some political savvy, or at least he had people working for him with that, and Carter lacked that to a very large degree, so was fairly ineffective at moving forward with his platforms. And I think, once again, we have to look at another aspect of that, in that the Republicans and the people who voted Reagan into power really stood behind him. The Democrats really didn't get behind Carter. And we've seen something similar with Obama, that Obama's campaigns back about 8 years ago often looked like religious rallies. I mean, it was just wild. They were crazy. They looked like rock concerts. They were rock concerts. Everybody got very, very excited. But once he became president, that kind of went away. People voted for Obama didn't really get behind him in a big way. And I think there's a huge lesson here, that we need to get behind the candidates once we elect them. We also need to recognize that even when our candidate isn't elected, there's a lot we can do to keep pushing our agendas forward, the things we really, really believe in, and that we, the people, are the ones with the power. We have to also understand, I think, that our elected officials are extremely vulnerable. If someone really stands up to the system, they're likely to be torn apart. As an example, and I talk about this in the books, John Kennedy, the only president in my lifetime who hasn't been supported by big corporations, wasn't elected with big corporate money. His father basically financed his campaign. We've now got two candidates running who claim not to take money from corporations, Sanders and Trump, opposite ends, but they're both claiming this. The only one that's taking money from big corporations, and admits it at least, is Hillary. But if we look at Kennedy, everybody knew Kennedy was having affairs with lots of women, and that was okay. They had to take him down with a gun. Now, when Clinton came along, he was politically assassinated with a sex scandal. He was impeached. And, you know, you didn't need a gun anymore. The morality of the country, the attitude of the country had changed so much that you could destroy a person politically by a rumor, or in this case it was apparently a fact. And he lied about it, which was unfortunate. But I think everyone out there has skeletons in their closet. And even if we could, let's assume Sanders doesn't have any skeletons, and let's assume he gets elected and doesn't take any money from corporations. If the FBI wants to, they can plant skeletons in his closet. They have access to all of his emails, all of his phone messages. You know, whoever is in a position of power today, and it's not just the president, it's also our other elected officials, and so our corporate executives. They're in very, very vulnerable positions. They can be assassinated politically or professionally without a gun, without physical injury. And we need to get that. We need to understand that.
I want to double down on that because I remember John Edwards was very, very popular. And, you know, he was a very successful attorney, and he went after corporations, and he stood on behalf of the people in certain cases, not in all cases. Obviously, we have a right-shifted, pro-corporate spectrum of political thought in America today, right? But as far as that goes, he actually did make some waves, and what happened to him? A huge scandal came out, and he was politically assassinated, just like you just mentioned in this story.
Well, there's a lot of examples of that, Nick. I mean, another one is John Dean. You remember the scream? Well, he didn't really scream. He was enthusiastic. That's not usually considered bad. I think it was a setup. Frankly, I mean, this is just a supposition, but I think that the powers that behind the election didn't want him in there, and they had something on him. And the scream was a way for him to bow out without being exposed for whatever they had on him. We also saw the head of the IMF, Strauss-Kahn, who was quite possibly going to be the next president of France and was looking at really attacking the European central banking system. We saw him taken out by a sex scandal. Now, in that case, and in so many of these cases, John Dean and so many others, there's a real story. There's a real story behind the story. Strauss-Kahn was undoubtedly a sex addict. But you see, the system knows that. Those who want to take him out know that. You send a chambermaid who you've hired to seduce him into his room, and he's easily seduced anyway. He doesn't take very much, probably. But then, if you recall, Strauss-Kahn, you know, he succumbed to this weakness that they knew he had anyway. He did something inappropriate, something wrong. He'd been doing a lot of wrong things, apparently. But they waited till he got on an airplane in an airport in New York. I think it was JFK, and then sent in the police to take him off the plane in handcuffs with all the cameras rolling. The media knew this was going to happen. And that was not necessary. That was a huge show. That destroyed the man politically, and it was a setup. I have no doubt about it. And I'm also have no doubt that he was a sex addict. I'm not trying to defend his actions toward women, but I am saying that they know. If you got a weakness, man, watch out. Guard that weakness because it's going to come back to haunt you if you're in a position of power.
Let me take a second and ask. There are some interesting comments here in YouTube, and I want to ask. Just the first thing is, one of them says, "What I took from this is that it's an explanation for who got us to sign those trade agreements and why the world is flush with new ones, and they're trying to get nations to sign onto those." Yeah. I think okay, go ahead. If you understand the question, I was going to rephrase it maybe.
Well, the trade agreements, I mean, obviously the trade agreements are totally pro big corporations. They're putting big corporations in much more powerful positions. They're actually, as I understand it, and I read some of the leaked documents, it gives trade agreements sovereignty over countries, and that's ridiculous. You know, and first of all, it's always been highly, highly suspect when huge trade agreements like TTIP and TPP are negotiated in secret. Why doesn't the American public have a right to know? Big corporations were involved in the negotiations, but you and I weren't. Consumer groups weren't. And that makes it very suspect. Those trade agreements, we also know, are based on the foundations of CAFTA and NAFTA, the Central American and North American free trade agreements that impact Mexico and all of Central America. And we've seen disastrous consequences of both NAFTA and CAFTA. Just one example, if you're looking for an easy explanation of what's wrong with these trade agreements, just one of many examples. Let's say that a big agri-industry can produce a unit of corn for $5 here in the United States, a unit of corn. And it costs, but that same unit of corn can be produced by a peasant farmer in Central America for $3. However, the big agribusiness in the United States gets a $3 subsidy from the U.S. government. That means the agribusiness can sell that unit of corn in Central America for something somewhat above $2, let's say $2.50, whereas the local farmer has to sell it for more than $3. And that's exactly what's happened. The local farmer's gone out of business. The Central American countries cannot afford to give subsidies to their farmers. But because of the trade agreements, they also can't erect any kind of barriers like tariffs or taxes to bring that price up to a fair level to compensate for the subsidies that are paid in the United States. So these farmers go out of business. That's a large part of what we call the immigration problem here. Nick, you're in Texas. You're familiar with that problem. We're all familiar with that problem, you know. Trump wants to build a wall. Well, that's not the solution. The solution is help the small farmer in Central America because we've destroyed the small farmer. They can no longer make a living off farming. They're swarming to the United States to try to get jobs here. And in the process, their land now in Central America has been basically abandoned. The big industries, the big agri-industries have now gone to Central America. They've taken over these lands legally, and they're growing flowers and broccoli, things that are not consumed in Central America, but are re-exported back to the United States for huge profits. And it's created throughout Central America a desperate labor pool. So our big corporations can go down and open sweatshops and hire workers at less than the living standard because people in Central America are desperate. They're either going to flood to the United States, and that's a very, very dangerous route to take and very unstable, or they go to work for some big sweatshop at sub-living standard money, but at least it's something. And that's what the trade agreements have done. That and a lot more. That's just one of many examples. And if TTIP and TPP go forward, we're going to see that happen on a much, much larger level.
What do you say to the critics that talk about how trade is good and it creates economies of scale and it improves efficiency? You know, the usual garbage that you hear, you know, economists get up there and they talk about trade in this, you know, fairy tale-like way. But when you bring up the empirical data, they just kind of seem like that empirical data is just, you know, almost like a nuisance, like it doesn't mean anything. What would you say about that?
Well, I totally agree that trade's a great thing. And I think free trade, true free trade, we ought to have true free trade agreements, which would mean that the big farmer here in the United States couldn't sell his farm in Central America. He'd have to charge more than $5 a unit. And the Central American farmer would be doing just fine there, and the North American farmer could be selling his product here if we want. But free trade would mean that you wouldn't have any of these. Not only would you not have the barriers, which these agreements usually tear down, the tariffs, etc., but you also wouldn't, countries like the United States wouldn't be allowed to have subsidies. That's not looked at as contrary to free trade, but it should be. So total real free trade where the playing field really is level is undoubtedly a good thing, but in my opinion it is. But that's not what these agreements are. These agreements are totally skewed in favor of big corporations. And TTIP and TPP, in fact, make a situation where if a big corporation is in any country in the world, let's say a European country under these new potential agreements, and the country passes a law that restricts the corporation's ability to make profits because it sets in place environmental laws to protect the environment of those countries or social regulations to protect workers' rights in those countries, the corporation can sue the country for implementing laws to protect its environment and its people. That's ridiculous, and that doesn't serve the interests of anyone, anywhere in the world, except the people who own the majority stock in that big corporation. It looks as though they benefit. They make money off it. But since it's creating a much more unstable world and destroying resources, tearing down an economy, participating in the death economy, it ultimately is not helping the rich people either, because we all live on this tiny, fragile space station that's got no shuttles, and even the rich people can't get off either, and we're headed for disaster. If we hit disaster, if we don't change the course, which I know we can do, but if we don't change the course, everybody's going to crash, including the very rich.
Okay, another question from our YouTube channel. But before I ask this question, let me take a second to announce to everybody that just joined us. We are with John Perkins, the author of the New Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and you're basically plugged into the Benjamin Dixon Show. This is Nick. I'm hosting an interview with John Perkins here. Ben will be on tonight at 9. Now, we'll be ending a little bit early, but Ben will be on promptly on time at 9 o'clock. But the question from the YouTube channel was, what is the interplay between government and corporations that really make this so devastating? You said the government kind of stands behind the I guess the corporate empire, so to speak.
Well, yeah, that's an essential question, and it's a long one, and I go into great detail in the New Confessions of an Economic Hitman. So any interested reader, take a good look at the tremendous interlocking system of government and corporations. And what we just talked about, and so there's a lot in the book about that, many chapters, including the new economic hitmen that work for the big corporations here in the United States, the jackals that are using violence or threaten violence, and all kinds of manner of spying techniques on us, drones and everything else that we know about in the United States today, in Europe. There's a lot in the book about that. But to kind of give a short version of what we just talked about with the trade agreements is a good example that our government is supporting these trade agreements that are totally skewed toward big corporations. And I think we have to recognize that this revolving door policy is a highway to corruption. So when we have people that can run a big oil company, for example, and then go to Washington to be in charge of the body that oversees oil corporations, writes the rules for oil corporations, and then go back to work for oil corporations after 2 or 3 years in government, that's corruption. That just sets the stage for corruption. This whole revolving door thing. And we have to recognize that our politicians, so many of them, when they leave office, if they lose their next election or they decide not to run, they're going to get incredibly lucrative jobs as lobbyists or consultants for corporations, and they know that while they're in the office, so they tend to serve those corporations. It's human nature, It's a very hard thing to fight against, except by changing the laws to, for example, to make sure that when somebody leaves public office, they cannot go to work in an industry that they've been regulating or overseeing for at least 5 years.
Let me ask you this. Recently, the actual line that people have used to say that isn't corruption, they say you can't actually prove any kind of quid pro. They say stuff like you can't say that the money that they get in campaign contributions actually influences them because there's no evidence, or you can't read inside somebody's mind, or you didn't catch them at a diner exchanging briefcases of money, so you can't prove corruption. What would you say to that?
True. Can't prove it, probably. And it's legal, so it actually isn't corruption. These corporations aren't doing anything illegal by offering people jobs. But let's say, Nick, that, I come to you and I say, hey, Nick, hey, I really want to support you. You've got this project that you're working on. You're trying to develop something someplace, and I'm going to give you a couple of $1 million to help you develop it. And you've got this great radio show that you're doing, and I want you to promote me on that radio show. You can make me look good. And incidentally, if your radio show fails or you decide to get off there, I'm going to give you a job as a consultant at $500,000 a year to work for me. just, put me on your show once every month or so, or put someone on that makes me look good. And I'm not asking you to do anything illegal. I'm just asking you, I get some people out there that are dissing me. Promote my book a little bit, make me look good. What are you going to do, Nick, probably? I mean, and it may be that you actually believe in my book anyway, and so you're not really doing anything that lacks integrity, but it's a very, very questionable. And I go into detail on some specific examples in the book, and one of them I would mention is Senator Dodd of Connecticut. I liked Senator Dodd. I'm from New England. I'm from New Hampshire. I thought he was a cool guy. He was in the Senate for about 20 years. But I later found out that he was head of the Senate Finance Committee, and while he was in that position, he also ran for president and accepted huge amounts of money from the finance industry. He was head of the Senate Banking Committee. He accepted huge amounts of money from financial services organizations. It wasn't illegal, but I would call that very, very sketchy. If you're Senator Dodd and you're accepting all this money, and the same people that are giving you the money are coming to you and saying, hey, we don't really like this law that's being suggested that restricts the finance industry, and you're accepting this money from these people, it's going to be pretty damned hard for you not to listen to them very carefully, whereas you might not even open the door to someone who represented the other side.
I think that is an interesting point. Like what you said was, it's not illegal, and I think at a certain point we have to realize that it's not so much what they're doing is illegal. We're not trying to send them to prison. We're not trying to prove something beyond, whatever the burden of proof is to actually, for a criminal act to send somebody to prison, right? This is the court of public opinion, and that is totally separate from the legal word corruption.
Well, and I also think we should change the rules. I think someone who's head of the Senate Banking Committee should not be able, I think it should be illegal for him to accept money from the banking industry, from the financial services group. Well, of course, if we had the movement to amend, if we actually reformed the Constitution to get big business and big money out of the electoral process, that would solve that problem anyway, and that would be a big step. And of course, there's a huge movement in this country now to make that happen, which I totally support. That would have a big impact on the very things that we're talking about. It should be illegal for people to accept money when they're in a position to have control over those industries. It's not illegal now, but it should be.
Okay, and the point I would just want to add on to that is I agree with you 100%. The rules should be changed, but when we're judging politicians, we shouldn't be concerned only with the legality, because we know that the legal system in this instance is not proper. It's actually not working well, right? How are we going to judge them with the legal system when we know it's not equipped to deal with the situation? But
right.
Yet we're still using that like it's some sort of acceptable metric. But
right.
I really do 100% agree with him. You said 2 of your clients were assassinated. Why don't you talk about your personal interaction with these individuals, Jaime Roldos and Torrijos?
Yeah, Roldos was the first democratically elected president of Ecuador after quite a few years of brutal military dictators who I'd worked with as an economic hitman, and were very much supported by the U.S., by the World Bank, by my organization, and by our CIA. These guys were protected. And then one of them came along, an admiral, and decided that the country ought to have democratic elections. Roldos ran on a platform that said that the oil companies ought to, if they came into his country in big time, which they were doing, especially Texaco, should be very careful to protect the Amazon rainforest where they were drilling, and also should make sure that the Ecuadorian people got a fair share of the profits made from Ecuadorian oil. And both Torrijos and Roldos strongly opposed Operation Condor, which was a CIA operation that supported right-wing dictators in Brazil, Argentina, and Chile, because at the time, it was the height of the Cold War, and it was assumed by Washington that Cuba was trying to take over the continent and turn it all communist, which seems a little absurd today when we think about Cuba. But anyway, that was the belief. Roldos and Torrijos was strongly opposed to Operation Condor and also these other things. I was sent down. I spent a lot of time with both of them to try to convince them to change their ways, to go along with our system. They didn't. Roldos died when his plane crashed in circumstances that most people believe were not an accident. Torrijos at that time said, "My friend Jaime was killed by the CIA, and I'll probably be next." Less than 3 months later, he also was killed when his plane crashed under very suspicious circumstances, very much like Roldos's. There's no question in my mind, and most people that have really been close to the situation, that those were both assassinations. In fact, I was just giving a TEDx talk in Michigan last week, and one of the other speakers was a former Marine Major General in the Marine Corps, who was another speaker and had been in Panama at the time. And I asked him, I said, "So what do you think happened to Torrijos?" And he said, "Oh, he was assassinated." And I said, "Well, General, are you sure?" And he said, "Nothing's 100%, but I'd say 98% certain, yes." And I said, "Who do you think did it?" And he said, "Well, I think Noriega, who replaced Torrijos, did it." And I said, "Well, but wasn't Noriega a CIA asset?" And he said, "Well, yeah, he was at times." We don't know exactly who was behind those murders, but I don't think there's almost no question by anybody who's knowledgeable in this that they were both assassinated.
Now, I remember when you talked about our elected officials being vulnerable, and this is in our country, in the United States. They're vulnerable to influence and assassination, you know, via publicity or in the public eye. But these people were assassinated overseas, right? So you see these politicians be assassinated. That's the stick. So they come to you with the EHM, and you have the carrot. You have, you know, whatever special deal you're going to offer them, or whatever they want, or whatever their vices may be. That's their carrot. And if they refuse and they stand on principle, there's the stick. So when the system operates like that, how many individuals would really stand up and be willing to go alone and be out there and be crushed?
It's a critical question. People often ask me, didn't I have a difficult job convincing these presidents to basically exploit their own countries and their own people? And the answer is no. In most cases, I didn't. I'm offering them these huge loans, which are going to make them and their families wealthy. There's all kinds of systems set up so that they get money back, usually legally. I can get into that more detail if you want. But and at the same time, I'm reminding them that, and incidentally, the CIA's own website and recently declassified documents admit that the agency participated in the overthrow or assassination of Prime Minister Mossadegh of Iran, President Arbenz of Guatemala, and Diem of Vietnam, Lumumba of the Congo. Perhaps best known of all is President Allende of Chile, who was replaced by a brutal dictator who was a huge supporter of Operation Condor, oversaw the murder of tens of thousands of his people, and was praised by Secretary of State Henry Kissinger as a great supporter of capitalism. Our country's admitted to participating in the overthrow and/or assassination of these presidents. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I don't believe in some overarching conspiracy to take over the world. But there's no question that there's been conspiracies, and our government admits to them. We've admitted to a lot of them. And of course, our government is actually the biggest conspiracy theorist out there. They're constantly telling us that somebody's after us, ISIS, or somebody's conspiring to do something here. And I think we really need to face these facts, that our government does do these things. I don't like it, and I want to stand up against it. It's not part of democracy. And I believe that democracy requires transparency. It demands that we question our government officials, that we ask them, and is this really helping us create a better world? Is this really helping us present an image to the world of a country that believes in democracy and capitalism? No, it isn't. It's doing the opposite. I want to see that change.
You know, you talked about Chile, and was Allende before Pinochet? Is Pinochet who you're talking about, the brutal dictator in Chile?
Yeah. Yes, General
Okay.
Pinochet. Yeah.
So Pinochet comes into Chile, and he implements like a very, very, very harsh economic plan. And the brainchild for all of this was Milton Friedman and his Chicago boys, right? So they send those guys down there, and they perform an experiment, and it completely destroys the country. Like it's terrible, 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 and it shows that it fails. Yet you said at the time that people were praising this man and praising all the things he was doing there, all the way through when it was producing outwardly terrible results.
Right. But it was producing really good results for our corporations. So one of the main reasons that Allende was overthrown and that Operation Condor was put into effect was because of corporations like ITT, which you may not have even heard of these days, but that was a company that had huge power in the United States at the time, the big communications company. Harold Janine, who was their CEO, was on the cover of Time. He was very, very well known. It was a very powerful company. Anaconda Copper, which was a bigger U.S. corporation that was taking copper out of Chile. There were many other companies like that. And throughout the hemisphere, there were a lot of oil companies and other big companies that wanted to see policies put into place that supported huge corporations at the expense of local companies and local people. And so that was the justification for, well, that was the reason behind a lot of this. The justification was communism. That these people were accused, Allende was accused of being a communist. He was a socialist, but he wasn't a communist. Torrijos and Roldos, who I knew personally well, didn't like communism. They didn't like the Soviet Union. They tended to be socialistic. They wanted socialistic policies. They wanted the people to get a fair share of the profits from these extraction companies. They wanted to have better education systems, better healthcare systems, but they were not communist by any means. And there's really, as we look back, there's really no evidence that Cuba was really trying to spread communism. Yes, Castro was talking a lot about such things and promoting a philosophy that was really more socialistic than communist. But he was supported by Russia. And so that opened the door for us to, as the United States, that is to say, to go after these people as communists. We were terribly fearful at the time of the Red Scare, you know, that was going on. It was the Vietnam War was just beginning to heat up at that time, and we were terrified of communism around the world. The Soviet Union was very scary to us.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I wasn't alive during that time, but when you look back at that stuff, it does seem like it was more sensationalism than an actual belief by people in administration. Do you disagree to that? Do you believe that was actually a belief, or was it just propaganda to justify all sorts of nonsense?
Well, I can only speak for myself in that regard, and I was fearful. My dad was, he was a Republican. He was fearful, but there was good reason to a certain degree. I mean, Stalin was a terrible person. You know, he was a Hitler type person. He did terrible things. The Soviet Union was a scary country, and it had nuclear weapons. And Khrushchev was a pretty scary person many times. So there was real cause for fear, I think, there. And in terms of the Soviet Union, I don't think we really had that cause for fear in Latin America. And I went down in the Peace Corps in the late 60s, 68. Allende wasn't overthrown and died until a few years after that. I was down there at the time. I was there very shortly after Che Guevara was assassinated, was killed in Bolivia. I actually met the CIA agent who killed him, who was in charge of killing him, who ordered him killed, and actually ended up writing about it, Felix Rodriguez. I didn't think that communism was a threat to Latin America in any way. Most Latin Americans that I knew they much preferred the United States or the Soviet Union. They weren't interested in becoming a Soviet puppet, but they also weren't interested in becoming a U.S. puppet. And there was a lot of independence-minded things going on there. And throughout Latin America, there was a strong antithesis to what was going on in Vietnam. People thought, I kept hearing how much people resented the fact that the United States was involving itself in a Southeast Asian country. They didn't fall for our line of the domino effect. And so they were generally nervous in Latin America that the United States was trying to do something similar in Latin America. And in fact, we were. We were putting into place these right-wing dictators who were very, very strong advocates of American corporations, supported our oil companies, supported our copper extraction companies, supported our telecommunications companies and some of the big department stores and so on and so forth, and the big agribusinesses that were going in and taking out bananas and pineapples and shrimp and all kinds of other things. And Latin Americans were very leery about this.
I'm going to tie two things together here. Like, I remember I read something a long time ago where Jefferson said that to have one generation basically in debt another generation was an abomination. Yet in Latin America, we have dictators installed by the U.S. signing agreements or putting in place policies that allow, signing agreements for loans and things that indebt the nation for, years and years and years and years to come. And you see, like, there's an entire continent, basically South America was basically under this boot of debt peonage to the United States. Can you kind of talk about, like, how they get trapped in it and why it's such a big deal and what the sweetheart deals that the corporations get out of it actually, what they actually are?
Yeah, and I go into a lot of detail in the new Confessions of an Economic Hitman, Nick. But one example, let's go back to Ecuador. So Ecuador is ruled by this military junta, and I go down there in the 70s as an economic hitman, and other people do too, and convince this junta to take out huge loans from the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, build big electrical systems, hydroelectric projects that destroyed some rivers, destroyed some indigenous lands, and so on, but provided electricity to the big industries there. And we knew that the military dictators were going to make huge amounts of money off these projects because they had brothers or friends that owned subcontractors, pipe layers, and people like that we would pay top dollar to. Our construction companies would pay top dollar. They wouldn't ask for discounts. They'd pay top dollar. Members of their families who had John Deere franchises or Coca-Cola franchises, and we bought a lot of Coke and paid prime price. And we also offered scholarships to their children. We'd set them up to go to college in the United States, give them huge scholarships. So there were all these kind of legal bribes that went on with the military junta. They took out these huge loans. Now, about 8 years ago, the democratically elected president of Ecuador, Rafael Correa, took office. Correa has a PhD in economics from the University of Illinois. He understands the system. One of the first things he did was to renegotiate the oil contracts to make them more favorable to his country. Second, one of the other first things he did was to appoint a commission to look at debt, the very debt that I had helped impose. The commission decided that $3.7 billion worth of foreign debt was not owed by the people of Ecuador because it had been taken on by these military dictators. And they'd gained from it, but the people of Ecuador hadn't gained very much. And so Correa refused to pay the money. And as a result, he was downgraded by Moody's, the World Bank, the IMF came after him. China gave him $1 billion bridge loan, made it easy for him to start repaying it. His credit rating went back up. And now he's taken a hell of a lot of credit from China. And I'll say that. And Correa, incidentally, endorsed one of my books. He says, "Yeah, this Economic Hitman book, it tells what's happened here." And he's done some things since then. He's been compromised to a large degree. That's another whole story. But the fact of the matter is, this debt was taken on, I was aware of in the 70s, by these military dictators who used it primarily for their own personal gain and the gain of their cronies. And the guy who stood up and refused to pay it later was dissed by our financial community, and now it's turned to China. And we're seeing this over and over. And I think that's a shame, because I hate to see China make these huge inroads, but on the other hand, so many of these leaders around the world now look very skeptically upon the United States and our foreign policy. And they'll say to me, yeah, China may end up doing the same thing, but they haven't. The United States and your banks, you've proven that you can do this, and you will do it.
All right. Thank you very much, John, for joining us today. It seems that we're out of time, but I really would like to explore that more some other time. Maybe we can catch you when you have some time to speak with us again.
I'd love to, and I wish we'd get into more about what we all can do, because I'm very, very encouraged that everybody can turn this thing around. So go to my website.
Find the time for us. I definitely will have another session where we can get into that. But if you can have everybody be able to reach you by your website, can you mention that real quick?
Yeah, johnperkins.org. Buy the book. It's got all the details in it. Lists of things everybody can do. Go to my website. Sign up for my newsletter. You got to actually put your email in there. johnperkins.org.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. Keep up your good work.
Bye-bye.
Bye.